The first few months of our marriage was nice. Alistair was a doting puppy, happy to give me all the attention I craved and content to allow me to run the Arling of Amaranthine how I saw fit. I did my best to pull the Chantry's claws out of him, but there were some mentalities that would always have residual effects on how he saw the world. We both marveled at the new walls that Merida's dwarves had crafted for Vigil's keep, and how quickly they went up. Triana was a darling, and the symbology of her gift wasn't lost on me, but it was a tree. Not really much to marvel at there. Though Alan compensated with some magic rings which he told everyone would shine in the direction that Alistair or I was, he'd also added an enchantment to mine that allowed for some decent elemental resistances. We didn't have too much to worry with, like Merida and the Darkspawn, or Triana and Alfric with Solace. These were ancillary concerns in our pocket of the world. We would need to contribute to the effort of defeating them somehow, but I was waiting to see how Merida approached the problems and what plan she would come up with. Among all of the fated, she was clearly the most knowledgeable about Thetis, and far away the most powerful. We were all secondary characters to her, but I was determined to always be her equal in some way. To that end, I had to build up my Arling and increase its potential as a port and trade center, and to climb the ranks politically. As far as the Arling went, we already had the city of Amaranthine, which was the largest port city in the north. I had construction on additional ports begun in the city, as well as along the inlet that led to the city. Over the next few years, I was planning on increasing the city's size to encompass the whole of the inlet. This would make it one of the largest cities in the world, further increasing the Arling's prestige and revenue. However, I also had Pilgrim's Pass in the Arling. Pilgrim's Pass was an important land trade route through the north of Ferelden which led to the capital city of Denerim. In the game, the pass was plagued by Darkspawn after the Blight, but we must have crippled their numbers sufficiently enough that they couldn't bolster enough troops to harass the trade caravans. I took some of the money we'd received from King Merrick as a dowry and used it to establish 2 small towns along the pass whose primary purposes were to facilitate trade and protect traders along the pass. These towns were quick to grow, with members from the dwarven surface caste seizing on the opportunity to establish inns and small guard companies people could hire out to protect their wagons and goods. Indeed, the surface caste helped to facilitate a great deal of my plans. Of all the contracts for the city's expansion I'd made, a great majority of them were through the dwarves. They were crafty businessmen, but their contracts came with superior craftsmen and labor compared to humans. They weren't particularly skilled at building docks and piers, but that only meant that they were as talented at it as any humans would be. So human contacts were mostly limited to building the seaports and docks, while the dwarves would create the roads and buildings. Being a friend of Merida also meant that the dwarves gave me a significant discount on their prices. Growing the Arling was not the only step I was taking to elevate my position to be closer to Merida in prestige, however. While I might be an Arliss, that was still a step down from being queen. If I were to keep up with Merida, I would need to somehow gain the title of Ferelden's ruler. Merida would no doubt be voted in as the next queen of the dwarves, so I had to do whatever I could to show King Merrick that of his 2 daughters-in-law, I was the more capable. His sons, as kind as they were not suited to be leaders. Alistair might grow into the role over time, but Kaelin would always be a fool. While Honora busied herself trying to curry favor with Merrick, I was taking a page out of Merida's book and meeting with every noble that I could. I invited them to dinners, discussed how they could invest in the city's expansion to grow wealthier and more influential, and sowed subtle doubts about Kaelin and Honora's ability to lead. I doubt Merida would have taken that last step, but I wasn't worshipped by my people, so I wasn't above slinging a little mud. I also dipped heavily into my personal savings to all but buy the abandoned alienage in Denerim, and was having the area rebuilt as a noble district similar to Orzamar's Diamond District. It would be a place for nobles to pay to stay in luxury while in Denerim. If everything went my way, I would eventually turn it into a prestigious series of homes for Ferelden's elite. With Amaranthine's growing influence, courting the nobles, sowing doubt about Honora and Kaelon, and gaining ground in Denerim with the alienage reconstruction, I liked my chances. However, there was another powerful card I could play to make things more sure. I could get the other fated to support my bid for the throne. Triana and Alfric would no doubt support me since Ferelden would be Ostagar's primary trade partner. I already had Alan's support, but I assured it by assuring him that I would elevate him to nobility and make the northern half of Lake Calenhad its own Arling, and that his bloodline would be granted title over it. The trickiest part would be convincing Merida and Farron. They didn't particularly care about what happened outside of Orzammar so long as the dwarves in the surface caste weren't being harassed. And Orzammar was functioning well. What I would need to do is try and ingratiate myself with her the way Triana had. Honestly, I think I made a mistake sending Triana to her all those years ago when I had the option to send Alfric. This was when I had the idea of having her connect the deep roads with Amaranthine itself, instead of just Vigil's Keep. Since dwarves preferred the use of the deep roads, I could offer her a waiver on all transport and storage fees on goods they import and export, but she'd likely argue that the deep roads were dwarven territory and that I couldn't charge her something her people stored there. It was a conundrum. Merida wasn't stupid. She'd almost single-handedly boosted Ferelden's entire economy by unleashing the dwarven surface caste. You could get anything from almost any market now with how industrious the dwarves were. Goods from every corner of Thedas flooded in, and Ferelden was richer and more influential than ever. I needed to find something that Merida couldn't get on her own, but she would also jump at the chance of either receiving or being able to offer to her people. But at this point, I wasn't sure if there was anything I could offer that she couldn't get herself. I would think about the matter over time. My real opponent was Honora. King Maer Ik thought highly of her, and she was extremely adept at politics. She had the prestige of being Tyrn Logain's daughter. She was already married to Kylan, who was Maer Ik's heir as well. She had the deck stacked in her favor. There was very little she didn't have in ways of advantage over me at this point. It was storming the night I was sitting in the drawing room by a crackling fire, surrounded by books of lineage and the history of Ferelden's noble lands, when a knock came at the door. I was busy trying to plan my elevation, as I always did in the evening. I'd always had strict instructions not to be disturbed, so a knock at my door was curious. The knock was followed by the door simply being opened. Whoever it was didn't even bother for me to bid them to enter. I was about to start laying into the person when Alistair peeked around the door. His expression was apologetic. "Alistair?" I asked, sitting up. He wouldn't bother me if it weren't important. "Is everything all right?" Alistair stepped into the room and closed the door. "I'm afraid not. I have some news that might upset you." That got my attention. I corrected my posture and moved a couple of books aside, then pat the sofa to have Alistair sit next to me. "Tell me." Alistair sat down with a sigh and looked at me directly. "Something has happened to Merida." My eyes widened in shock. "What? What happened?" "No one's sure." He shook his head. "We received word that she had gone on an expedition in the deep roads and was carried back to Orzammar. From what we've been told, she was strapped down to a cart and she was screaming in her sleep. They had no choice but to bring her through the city, but enough people witnessed it that word has spread. Apparently, she screamed the entire way back to her home and no one's heard a word from her since then. I didn't know how to feel about the news. On the one hand, I was terrified to think that there was something out there that could do anything like that to Merida. On the other hand, I gained some small amount of pleasure thinking that something had finally beat her. Still, I would need Merida if my plans to become queen were going to be possible. These conflicting emotions must have played out in a strange expression, because Alistair leaned in and rested his hand on mine. "I'm sure she'll be fine, my love. She's extremely capable and resilient." I drew in a long breath and nodded. That's one word for her. I hope you don't think me cold, but I cannot afford for anything to happen to her. She is the key to helping me achieve my goals. Alistair was all too familiar with my desire to become queen. He had no desire to be king, but he did want to please me. Say what you might about him, he was dedicated and loyal. Regardless of how he felt I was trying to push for too much, he was willing to help me reach my goals. "Well, let's just be glad no dwarf heard you say that," Alistair chuckled. "If they didn't kill you, they'd likely tear everything they've built down and make sure no one traded with us ever again." I nodded and groaned. "She's like a goddess to them. Do you know what that must be like? Oh, I have some idea. Alistair smirked as he stared at me. I laughed softly. It's not the same thing as the way you see me. But I do need her help to become queen. Her endorsement alone would make every human noble sit up and take note. Without her, Honora has just enough to keep me from seeming like the better choice. Well, can you blame her? Alistair shrugged. I mean, if she and Kaelin lose the chance to become king and queen, they'll only have the Tyrnir of Gwarin to go back to. Just the third largest port city in Ferelden and one of 2 Tyrnirs left as well. I'm sure they'd live squalor, I said sarcastically. Well, they would if they couldn't go back there, Alistair mused. I mean, it's not like someone could say they couldn't live there, so it's not like... A jolt ran through my brain and I gasped. What did you say? What? Alistair panicked. What? What did I say? About Kaelin and Honora not being able to go to Gwarin, I insisted as an idea ran through my mind. Huh? Oh, I said that it's not like someone could say they couldn't live there, Alistair stuttered. It's Honora's Tyrnir, inherited after her father died at Ostagar. Is it? I asked as I sifted through some of the books around me. Well, yes, Alistair said as he looked at me like I was talking nonsense. It's a title inherited by the closest living heir. But only if the heir is readily available to properly rule it, I nearly shouted in my excitement. I found the book I was looking for and frantically flipped through it to find a piece of obscure Ferelden law and pointed at it as I shoved the book in Alistair's face. I know for a fact that Honora hasn't gone back to Gwarin since her father's funeral, I grinned. She doesn't go there because her focus is on becoming queen. She just reaps the taxes, takes her cut, then allows the city's bureaucrats to use the rest to maintain the place. Alistair hesitantly took the book from me and read the passage for several agonizing moments. He looked up at me and seemed just as confused as always. But she is readily available to rule it. She could start doing so at any time. I shook my head and laughed. No, Alistair, you don't understand. Clearly. Why don't you enlighten me? He sighed in exasperation. Honora has no interest in governing Gwarin, I started simply. Because she believes that she'll be queen, and she has no family, still has no children, and has no desire to return to Gwarin. She won't care if someone else takes over the governance of the place. I still don't get it. How would you convince Honora to just give Gwarin to you? I don't have to convince them to give Gwarin to me. I squinted with delight at my own cunning. I only have to convince them to give Gwarin to Merida, and convince Merida that it's me giving it to her. Once Gwarin is hers, she'll do whatever it takes to keep it under dwarven control. And what better way would there be than to have one of her friends and fellow fated ruling the nation the Tyrnir resides in? Alistair seemed like the entire thing was making him dizzy. But could you even do that? You would basically be ceding over a sizable chunk of Ferelden to the dwarves, or making a dwarf a Tyrn of Ferelden. Wouldn't that mean her bloodline would also be considered human nobility? I wanted to cackle at the absurdity of it all. We'll let the Landsmeet decide that particular detail. What it does mean is that the nobles will wonder where Honora's priorities are when it comes to the people she's already supposed to be governing. This was it. A port city. Merida, along with the possibility of being named a noble of Ferelden. It would give her a wider reach with the surface caste and more influence in Ferelden. Now all I had to do was convince King Merrick and Honora. Oh, and I also had to hope that Merida pulled through whatever was ailing her.